Welcome to the Daily Tea. I'll be joined by this guy, Tim Stanley, who actually wanted to be MP for Scunthorpe, the home of the present row over British Steel.
And we're also talking to Andrea Jenkins, Reform candidate for Mayor of Greater Lincolnshire, on why she doesn't trust China with our steel and why she wants to create a Lincolnshire Doge.
The Conservatives, I found, are worse than the Corbynistas of 2017 with the way they behaved on the campaign trail. And actually from left and centre right, the attacks I've been getting. I've even had the police called on me this week saying I'm breaking electoral law on my nomination forms, which is complete lies, and the police are not doing anything about it.
Tim, Camilla is off interviewing brilliant people for future episodes of the podcast. Welcome to the Daily Tea, as always. We've got to start with this story. You wrote a wonderful column in today's Telegraph. Do go into our show notes to read that on British Steel and Parliament sitting in emergency session over the weekend, telling us how hard they were working for the future of British Steel. One MP tweeting that she had travelled, I think, at least 6 stops on the underground from her North London constituency to show how hard she was working for the future of British Steel. But in your column, Tim, you revealed what I would describe as a mic drop moment, that you applied to be the Labour MP for Scunthorpe. Just talk us through that.
I could see the direction that things were going in.
You did?
This was in 2010. I was still a member of the Labour Party, but I was close to leaving it. I still wanted to be an MP, and this was a last roll of the dice. I thought I had run for Parliament in 2005. 2010, shall I have another go? Maybe. Where would I like to go if I was to have a go? And one seat that appealed to me was Scunthorpe, and the reason for that was the steel industry. I was interested in defending what remains of British steel production. Steel production is a fascinating subject because this is a highly energy intensive, very expensive thing to make, but it's also something which goes into everything. Everyone uses steel. And therefore it's incredibly productive as well. You and I can sit in an office and we can spend an hour doing absolutely nothing. If you're running a steel furnace, every hour you're generating potentially millions of pounds of profit. But the problem is, in this country, we have allowed it to run down, while other countries have deliberately propped theirs up. It's not just some invisible hand of the market thing of steel is totally unprofitable if you're in the West. No, it's that we have made a decision that we would rather buy steel cheaply from China rather than make it in our own country. And one thing that blows my mind is that there is only one country in the world that has run its steel production down faster than us, and that's Venezuela. So steel sits at the heart of a debate about what kind of economy do you want? Do you need an industrial strategy in order to prop up key industries, which is what Donald Trump's starting to do in the United States with tariffs? But of course, it also touches upon the issue of environmentalism, because if you want a net zero economy, steelmaking is really polluting. And you can go green. You could have an electric arc furnace instead of the old-fashioned 19th century style furnaces that we run at Scunthorpe and Port Talbot. But if you do that, it requires less jobs. So even if you transition to a greener form of steel, we're still talking about managing the decline of a once great industry.
Let's go through where we are today. As we said at the beginning of the podcast, MPs came to the House of Commons on Saturday to pass this emergency legislation, which has, to all intents and purposes, put the government in control of the Scunthorpe blast furnaces. It is actually owned by a Chinese company, Jingye, but this new legislation means that the government are able to force, if necessary, it to make decisions, and it's hired today a CEO and also the chief financial officer to run the company. Daisy Cooper, the deputy leader of the Liberal Democrats, made a very interesting point after Kemi Badenoch had said to the Labour MPs, "You're enjoying this, aren't you? The idea of a government being able to take whatever the controversies about China and a Chinese company, being able to take powers to control a privately held business, which took Scunthorpe blast furnaces out of receivership under Boris Johnson, is actually something that we should be wary of." And Daisy Cooper argued that there should be what's called a sunset clause, so that these powers were only in place for a given period. quite surprising to me that the Liberal Democrats remembered at least half of their name, which is that they are liberals and believe in private property rights.
Yeah.
Jonathan Reynolds, the business secretary, refused this sunset clause. And I think that we should, although I agree completely with your analysis about a change of mood around nationalisation of things like British Steel in a way that Margaret Thatcher would have always thought it must be for the market to decide, as she did in coal, with the closure of so many plants, because frankly you could get cheaper coal from then the European continent, not much further afield than that. It was mostly Poland actually was where our coal was coming from in the 1980s. That to do that, we have to allow government power in markets, which to me, and actually Daisy Cooper, does start to raise issues around the government backing what ultimately become unprofitable drains on what is taxpayer money. The Scunthorpe blast furnace is losing £700,000 a day. We have to find a model which they appear to have been able to build in, for example, the Netherlands, our near European neighbour, where Tata Steel, which is actually an Indian conglomerate, has supported virgin steelmaking in the Netherlands, which is broadly competitive and profitable.
Yeah.
We need to look to that model rather than, for me, Jonathan Reynolds controlling how we run our steel industry.
First of all, Jonathan Reynolds would say, I can't sunset this because I don't know how long the negotiations are going to go on. It's the nature of the crisis that I don't know when these powers will become no longer necessary. He would also say the long-term future is a public-private partnership. It's not government control, and actually Labour doesn't want to do that, however excited some of the backbenchers are. In fact, during that Saturday debate, it was the quote-unquote right-wing party Reform that was saying, let's just nationalise it now. Be bold. Take it over right now. And if you do that, as you say, rightly, you're immediately putting all the costs onto the taxpayers' books. And also the company is in an immediate practical crisis of having to supply coal, which the Jingye ordered but did not pay for, from Japan, which means that you've got to get that coal in there, because if you shut down a furnace, if you don't fuel it, there's a risk that it cools down and irreparable damage takes place. So there's an immediate crisis the government had to respond to. But of course, also this question of what is the future model, it's got to involve our energy being cheaper. Whatever we do, one reason why we are stacking things against British Steel is because in this country we run incredibly high energy bills. And part of the story of that is anti-carbon taxes and government policy. And therefore, Ed Miliband has to explain, and the Labour has to explain, why on the one hand it's saying we desperately want to save this giant, this symbol of British industry, and on the other hand we're pushing so fast with net zero that we're piling on the costs, which makes it unprofitable to run that kind of industry in Britain.
Now, one of the issues that is connected to this is the closure of our coal industry, the complete closure of our coal industry. As I said, Margaret Thatcher decided that the coal industry under public ownership was inefficient and loss-making, as it was, that there were new, cheaper supply chains from Europe. Our coal mining industry was decimated in the literal sense of the word, cut to a tenth of what it was. But we have gone from there to a situation now where we have no coal production in the United Kingdom. We had agreed before the election that a new coal mining plant in Cumbria would be given the go-ahead. That was then reversed by this Labour government.
It was taken to court by activists. One should say the reason why this was held up was because it was taken to court by activists, and the new Labour government declined to put a case in court for allowing the mine to open. So it's not quite that Labour expressly vetoed it, it's that it declined to support it, and it was NIMBY green activists who really prevented it from happening.
Which is always the problem with people saying we need to grow fast, we need to cut planning consents.
Someone will
and
just
do
take
like
it
that.
to court.
Lots of people will take it to court. Interesting, I was in Suffolk at the weekend, and across that coast are protest banners against the connections of the new wind farms in
Right.
the North Sea coming onshore along the Suffolk coast, because at the moment we are building all these wind farms
Yeah.
and we are not connecting them to the national grid, which
And
again
there's
is part of our
there's an
electricity
argument
price problem.
within the Green Party over this. Some Green people are not comfortable with the new infrastructure that's being built in order to go green.
And you're seeing massive building sites. There's also Sizewell nuclear power station there, which is being rebuilt or modernized as our present fleet of nuclear power stations comes to the end of its functioning life. The problem with the China situation and the ownership of British Steel is that I worry the threat is that the ship has sailed on us relying on cheaper China investment in the UK. If we think of nuclear power, if we think of things like HS2, we think of all the major projects, we have relied for a long time and rocket boosted under David Cameron and George Osborne on Chinese money to build things in the United Kingdom. And China has warned, do not politicize one small part of the investment environment that you so gain from China. And as we've seen in America, even America, you take on China at your peril.
Yeah.
So America over the weekend put on these huge tariffs, 145% on China, because of what they argue is a huge trade deficit with that country. Over the weekend, they have reversed a huge number of them on technology, particularly on smartphones, because Donald Trump had to make the calculation, probably the right one, that people were keener on cheaper iPhones and cheaper laptops than they were on Make America Wealthy again, because that immediate problem with bringing steel production back to the UK in any mass way is that steel does become more expensive. And as you say, it's in everything and it has knock-on effects.
The interesting question is, so why is there a consensus around not just saving, but potentially controlling British steel? And I think the element of China helps to explain that. Conservatives who would otherwise be critical of the government's actions, and some of them, like David Davis, did express some reservations. Nonetheless, because China's involved, they suspect that this is not, I'm not speaking for Davis, but certainly IDS, Ian Duncan Smith, they suspect that this is not just a case of a company hasn't worked or a business is no longer profitable. This isn't a how does the free market function issue. They suspect industrial sabotage. They think China has deliberately taken over half our steel production in order to drive it down so that we'll have to rely upon Chinese imports instead. So that's one reason why there's a consensus around this, because even if you don't like state intervention, the right wing hates China right now.
And it does appear that a way forward is to hive off. This is what Jonathan Reynolds, the business secretary, is suggesting. You hive off certain industries and say he claimed that if it had been in front of him, the decision that Boris Johnson agreed for this Chinese firm to take Scunthorpe out of receivership, he said he wouldn't have chosen that firm. The problem with the British steel industry, it is too small. You need to have a certain scale.
Yes.
And I say this probably quite nervously. If we were still a member of the European Union, which I don't think we should be, a scale steel industry would work, for example, in partnership with the Netherlands.
Right.
The Netherlands is a large steel producer. Would there be a way to network the effects across the North Sea of 5 or 6 blast furnace factories? Because then you get the mass that it enables you to enter the market in the way that India does and in the way that China does. Daniel Hannan, Lord Hannan, big Brexit campaigner, he said in the House of Lords at the weekend, because the House of Commons had the vote and then the House of Lords also had the debate to pass this emergency legislation, all in this one day of quite sort of, we hadn't had an emergency debate over a weekend since the Falklands War. So, I mean, this was quite a
During
moment.
recess.
During recess.
Apparently we have had them at weekends during ordinary working
Yes.
day, but this is the first
But
time
quite
in
a
recess.
moment of not quite panic, but this was urgent and an emergency in field. But Daniel Hannan argued that there are 7 or 8 suppliers to the United Kingdom, and taking away free market mechanisms, even in steel, is dangerous because you get into a situation where we got to in the 1970s where governments, states, Whitehall are just very bad at running things.
Well, Dan would say that.
He would. But
I love him, but he's a 19th century liberal. When I showed up to this debate, I was there half an hour beforehand, and this was before all the other journalists had arrived, and the only two people on site, we thought we'd be the only two people there, were me and the Morning Star. The communist newspaper. And I said, this is telling. Only the Telegraph and the Morning Star care about the future of steel.
It is, though.
And we agree on it. We both want to control it.
It does pick up, though, on the way that J.D. Vance has built this bridge between unionized workforce, state control, and the right in the way that Nigel Farage, Richard Tice are exploring in the UK. And you wrote in your column, well, tell us what you wrote in your column about South Wales, Port Talbot, the elections. I think it's 2026, isn't it? The Senate elections for the Welsh Assembly.
Year, yeah.
Or next year. 2026. What was the argument you made there? Because that connects these things together.
Well, the populist right can see an opening. They think the issues of the China, net zero, everything comes together if you're running on a nationalist ticket to say, this is the kind of industry Britain should be defending. And the Tories would never defend it because of their free market principles. Labour has failed to show sufficient enthusiasm in defending it and is also undermining it with their green policies. And in particular, both Reform and Plaid are looking to do well in the Welsh Assembly elections. And they're saying, well, when Port Talbot faced a similar crisis, you didn't say everything was on the table then. You didn't talk about nationalisation then. Why is it you're getting so excited about Scunthorpe just ahead of local elections, where there's also an election for the mayor of Greater Lincolnshire? How come you're getting so excited about saving Scunthorpe in a way you weren't about saving Port Talbot? So I find this really interesting that parties that a few years ago economically were still pretty right-wing are now talking about things like tariffs in America, nationalisation in this country, because they can see that the working class has gone off Labour as a party and they see an opportunity. One thing I'll just throw in, though, there's a difference. The method might be the same on the populist right when it comes to things like tariffs and nationalisation, but they typically want to do these things for different reasons for why the left wants to do them. The left usually sees it as some means of increasing equality and democratic control over resources and industries. The right's not so interested in that. The right is more interested in the business nationalist case. It's a kind of it's a sort of a state-directed trickle-down theory of if the state saves this business or a state applies this tariff, it'll create the conditions within which business can thrive and the wealth can trickle down. The left, including me back in 2010, when I was thinking of running for Scunthorpe, the reasons why we want to put tariffs on things, not me now, but me then, and why we want to nationalise things is because we want to create a greater equality of wealth and power. So although right and left are increasingly saying the same things, the motivations are subtly different.
I think just to add to that, I think there is a defence of sort of somehow workers' rights and working people and this romanticisation of a manufacturing industrial past, which I think affects the left and the right.
Yes.
This idea of somehow, if only we could go back to a maybe pre-20th century model, or certainly 20th century model up until the Second World War and the real start of globalization post the Second World War, the idea of world order and the idea of trade across borders. I think there's a romanticization of that. Just hold that thought, though, on Lincolnshire, because as you say, is there a connection? Yes, is there a connection? Is there a connection between what Labour has done now in comparison with what it failed to do over Tata and Port Talbot? We are going to be joined in a few minutes by Andrea Jenkins. She is the former Conservative MP and now Reform candidate for Mayor for Lincolnshire. But just before we do that, let's hear from Scunthorpe itself. Our reporter, Pieter Snepvangers, he was there in the town on Saturday as news broke of these emergency laws being passed in Westminster, and he got some instant reaction on that day from people there.
Obviously, there's a lot of people in this town that depend on the steelworks. There's people that rely on the steelworks. It's not as big as it used to be, but it needs saving. If it closed, I mean, I don't know what impact it would have on the town. It's not as big as it used to be, like I say, but it wouldn't be good for the town at all. It's what we're known for. We're a steel town, so I voted reform me. So yeah. If they step in and they save the steelworks, then fair play to them. But yeah, I'm not Labour. It's Nigel Farage that everyone wants in, I think.
Worked for PIT for 28 years, then had to give that job up. We had to flit to find work because we got a young baby, and that were it.
Yeah, so it's almost like deja vu, seeing it happen again, potentially happen again.
We're going
the
back
next generation.
Well, they're trying to keep us in Maggie Thatcher's days, aren't they?
If you've spoken to anybody for at least the last couple of decades, everyone has always said that nationalisation is the best way forward. The pride that our community has in steel, and especially when it was British steel. I mean, my dad was a steel worker, my grandpa was a steel worker, my great-grandpa was a steel worker. It runs through the fabric of the town, and anybody that you speak to, they've just got such a love for the steelworks. And I think if this came 2 years ago with a different government, I think they showed with Port Talbot. I know that Labour are involved, but there's ins and outs to that. I don't think that would have happened. I think we have been. I mean, Labour, I'm not the greatest fan at the moment, but I think that if there was anybody else in power, I think they'd be just as happy to let it shut than let it carry on. What is around here? Everywhere's based around steel. The steel industry goes, no one's going to be moving here, so that's a building industry potentially. So just leave a void, just like it has there, just as it has in most deindustrialised towns.
It's massive for the town, but it's massive for the country as well. We are the last steel producer in the country. It's been here an awful long time. The country will be lost without it. We've been failed for too long.
And how long have you two both worked there?
60 years.
60 years. And how has it changed in that time?
Massively, and we've been failed massively, especially in the last 20 years or so.
Who's failed you?
Collection of owners and governments.
Foreign owners.
Yeah. And what did you make of the foreign owners?
Absolutely ruthless.
Yeah.
Just run it into the ground.
Really?
Terrible.
I think that's been the plan from the start for the foreign owners.
Pieter Snep-Vangers there speaking to some of the residents of Scunthorpe about the threat to the blast furnace. We're joined now, as we said, by Andrea Jenkins, who's actually on the campaign trail. From your car, where are you, Andrea?
I'm furthest south of Lincolnshire. I'm at Market Deeping. I've just been to see a resident who emailed me. So, you're catching me from here. Then I'm off to Stamford next. So.
Well, we really appreciate you joining us from the campaign trail. Andrew, just give us your overview of the last 48 hours. We've basically got to a position now where the government has enforced a new CEO for the Scunthorpe Steel Works. The taxpayer is now, it appears, on the hook from today, presumably, for the £700,000 a day losses that plant is making. We have your leader demanding that British Steel be nationalised immediately, on the same side of the political debate as Jeremy Corbyn. It's quite an unusual world we find ourselves in.
Look, I mean, all I can say, first of all, about this £700,000, I think this is figures from the company, isn't it? The Chinese company who's said this. So I'm not sure that they've been audited with those figures. So I think we need to, be careful about quoting these until we've audited them as a government, I think. But look, as someone who was a Conservative for many years, and I know the Telegraph, usually their views, it's not, somebody is centre-right, it's not a natural position to be in to look for nationalising something. However, because British Steel is so strategically important to Britain, I think that Nigel and Richard is right on this, actually, because we can't be the only G20 country to not have our own steelmaking capabilities. So this is why I'm sort of really behind what Nigel and Richard are saying. Now, we've seen about the coal situation, but we could get coal from Cumbria. So I think Richard was right in his speech in the Commons this week where, this shouldn't be a halfway house. Let's turn this into an opportunity for Britain and for the 3,000 British Steel families up in Scunthorpe by nationalising it and really strengthen our steelmaking capabilities. Richard also mentioned a key point in, we could have these public sector contracts who buy from British Steel, and so we can get it back on its feet and actually make it thrive. So I think that Richard's speech summed up really what the direction should be. But on top of that, if you don't mind me carrying on, is I've been several times over the last few months to British Steel. I've met with the management, I've met with all the workers, and you're talking some families who's been there generations, and this is, if we don't support them, it'll rip the heart of the community. And these talks with the Labour Party have been going on for months, and I mean, thankfully, we're seeing it's finally getting somewhere now, but it didn't have to get to this stage. They should have moved on it a lot quicker.
Andrea, some people would hear that and say, okay, but you want to save that business. There are other businesses that also, if they disappeared, would tear the heart out of a community.
Yes.
So how do you explain why, for decades, Conservatives, and you used to be one, were willing to allow that to happen, and now people are changing their mind? And why is steel different to any other industry that could damage a community if it went?
No, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, I've clearly wrestled with these decisions myself because I'm not natural to want to nationalise things. But as I said, it's so strategically important for Britain. And I think what's happened really is, in my opinion, the Chinese company's gone in there, they've tried to run it down. So they can then be the kingpins globally on steel making capabilities. And I think for our own security, it's right that we save British Steel. I mean, it's different in other industries as such, but I definitely think British Steel is an important one. As I said earlier, we can't be the only one in the G20 not to have our own steel making capabilities.
You think China did do this deliberately then?
Well, and they got a reputation for doing this, going into different countries, buying companies and resources, and because clearly this is, in my opinion, they want to be global leaders on this.
Do you believe in private property rights, Andrea? It's just unusual to hear someone, as you say, formerly a Conservative member of Parliament, now campaigning for a right-wing party, supporting a government that has taken on emergency powers with no sunset clause agreed to enforceably take over, whatever we think of the ownership structure, absolutely, to enforceably take over a business.
Look, it should have actually, we should have took ownership of the business and nationalised it. I mean, I'm not sure what the British Steel workers feel about this enforced management, because, they've been trying their best. I know some of the directors there, they've been trying their best for a long time. So, look, it isn't a natural place to be in, but we must save British Steel, and I do think it should be nationalised. It shouldn't be this halfway house, and actually turn it into a great steelmaking capability, which we can compete on the global market. Let's do that.
Do you think that China should be disbarred from involvement in other infrastructure projects in the country, given that it is closely involved in our nuclear industry, which is surely as strategically important as our steel-making capability? Should it be banned from involvement in nuclear power?
I personally think they should, actually. I mean, look, you're talking to somebody who didn't want France buying out EDF, our electric in Britain. So no, I do think with energy, we need energy security. And look, in Lincolnshire, we've got the gas find. I personally think we should get fracking. That'll save, tens of thousands per household. There's an energy crisis, not only for businesses, but also for consumers. Let's get fracking. That will seriously lower bills for people.
If I can ask about the local elections and your campaign, Andrea, some of the parties are privately saying, and they would say this, that they almost hope reform wins, because then it's a chance for reform to actually show what it would do in government, and they assume it would do very badly. Whether it would or not, you can't control the borders if you're elected mayor of Greater Lincolnshire. You can't nationalise Scunthorpe if you're elected mayor of Lincolnshire.
Yes.
What would be different about a reform government there that makes you worth voting for?
Look, I mean, there's several points to your question, actually. First of all, if I can just point out, I'm very surprised that some of the opposition are saying that because, look, I fought many campaigns over the years, general election and council elections, and the Conservatives I found worse than the Corbynistas of 2017 with the way they behaved on the campaign trail. And actually from left and centre right, the attacks I've been getting. I've even had the police called on me this week saying I'm breaking electoral law on my nomination forms, which is complete lies, and the police are not doing anything about it. So they're playing very dirty. But back to answering your question, look, this is an opportunity because to me, this is why I'm not over-promising. We've seen that apathy is at an all-time high. We've seen that trust in politicians is at a all-time low. And we've seen the mess the Labour government has made in these last few months, and people just don't trust politicians. So I will, I want to be able to deliver. And so this is why I said about a Lincolnshire Doge, the most important way to keep council tax down is looking for wastage. So that's what I want to do. But if I can just make a point as well regarding the powers of the mayor, I'm not sure if you looked into it, but the Greater Lincolnshire mayor doesn't have the same powers of like the Andy Burnhams, of the mayor of West Midlands, because the 3 Conservative council leaders have hamstrung this because they wanted to keep control. You're actually like a glorified committee chairman, and I've said this publicly before. So what I will have to do, I mean, I'm hoping that, Reform can also get the majority of councillors in Lincolnshire because it makes the role easier then. But if we don't get the majority councillors, I will have to use political pressure to get my manifesto through, because you can't even sort of like get your budget through without the say-so of the councillors. So I will be knocking on Angela Rayner's door that first week and saying, look, the Conservatives have made Lincolnshire the poor relation, give us the same powers as the mayors, and let's make this an opportunity for the people of Lincolnshire. So if they want someone who's going to fight for them and fight for common sense, I want, if I get elected, it'd be a blueprint for common sense, which hopefully we can then build on over the coming years to restore the trust in the public.
Do you imagine that Angela Rayner is going to react very positively to your request for more powers for reform to run policies that I'm assuming Angela Rayner largely disagrees with?
No, I mean, I've known Angela Rayner a lot of years. We got elected on the same time. We're obviously such a wide divide between ourselves politically, but it doesn't mean to say that you're not going to use political pressure. And look, I was a government whip under Boris's time. I know how to put pressure on, and we just got to try our best. But what I will do, I want transparency as mayor. If I'm elected mayor, I will broadcast all my meetings. And if people want to vote down having a Lincolnshire Doge where we actually scrutinise every penny of taxpayers' money, then so be it on those councillors who turn it down, because to me, that should be a no-brainer.
Well, that was really interesting, because you could tell that she was uncomfortable with the policy of nationalisation. It's not something she would instinctively do. It's not something she spent her life arguing for, but
arguing the opposite, I would imagine.
Arguing the opposite, but now she's got to argue in favour of it. Well, it's a constituency matter, and also, as I said, is to do with China. One way of justifying it to yourself internally is this is a strategic industry and it's under attack from China. And I sort of felt that was the way she was trying to sell it to us and to herself.
Yes, good luck with trying to extract China from its huge support and investment in, for example, our modernization of our nuclear power capabilities. Also, it's heavily involved in wind farm construction, solar panel construction. I just don't see how you can extract China. It's sort of in the water of our infrastructure, so very difficult to do. But it was quite your excellent question on how are you actually going to make a difference. I was just thinking it's like winning the mayorship is only powerful if you also win sort of Congress, like the White House and Congress. You can only do it if you actually have the council as reform as well. So we should watch on May the 1st what results happen in the council in Lincolnshire as well as in the mayoral battle.
And her answer was Doge.
Yes,
it's just interesting
Lincolnshire
how
Doge.
Reform is importing that idea. They clearly think it's very popular. And it does seem to be quite popular in America with the polling. But just what it comes down to is I'm going to make savings through cuts. And some might feel that's not a very creative approach to local authorities. Some might love it because they just want their taxes down. But it's just interesting that she goes straight for Doge.
It will be fascinating to see Andrea Jenkins with a chainsaw on public platforms the length and breadth of Lincolnshire.